Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. To the delight of some and the dismay of others, Bob Dylan has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature by the Swedish Academy. The American singer-songwriter's failure to attend the award ceremony is just one controversial aspect of the award intended by Alfred Nobel for those in literature who have produced the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. So, is a folk singer a literature figure? Does the Literature Prize have a history of unusual winners? And to those questions, we might even add the philosophical query, what is literature? Joining me in what will no doubt be a wide-ranging discussion of ideas, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhao Baisheng, Director of the World Autobiography Center at Peking University, Alois McAllister, a student at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Jess Field, whose PhD in nature literature is from the University of Minnesota, which Bob Dylan also attended. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at those.
Words have always been at the heart of Bob Dylan's music. And now the singer-songwriter has won literature's most prestigious award, the Nobel Prize.
Very simple. He's a great poet. And at the same time, he embodies the tradition and he handles it in a very original way. And his repertoire stretches from folk songs in the Appalachians, Delta blues, all the way to Rimbaud.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me in the jingle jangle morning.
He was born Robert Zimmerman and took his stage name as a nod to the poet Dylan Thomas. His lyrics are mysterious and evocative. He hit the folk scene as the 60s counterculture took hold. To many, he was known as the voice of a generation, though Dylan was never entirely comfortable in that role.
Do you think of yourself primarily as a singer or as a poet?
I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
In the mid-60s, he took folk electric, despite often being scribbled on hotel stationery. His lyrics resembled epic poetry as much as rock and roll.
We'll meet again someday on the avenue, tangled up in blue.
Over the years, Dylan has won many awards, including the Medal of Freedom from a fan in the White House.
And I remember, in college, listening to Bob Dylan and my world opening up.
The 75-year-old has never stopped making music, taking his poetic songs to China and around the world, keeping the focus on his words, even if their meaning isn't always clear. Jim Spellman, CCTV, Washington.
Were you guys surprised when words like Bob Dylan, literature, and Nobel Prize put together in the same basket and got featured prominently in the world media?
Actually, I'm not surprised at all, because I think that for the members of Swedish Academy, they always try to do something to surprise the world, to shock the world. This is what I call the Nobel Prize effect.
What do you think of this drama?
I'm not sure it can really be counted as drama, because people quite often say Bob Dylan and poetry together, and obviously no one would contest that poetry is counted as literature, so it seems to make sense.
As an American, I'm happy to see an American win the prize, and yes,
Well, I thought the Chinese are the most patriotic. He surprised me, declaring that the Americans are so proud of their own literary prize.
Yeah, there's some stories behind, because when Jesse said this, because the Americans waiting for the Nobel Prize for almost 3 decades, right? So the last time that when the Nobel Prize awarded to Americans, it was in 1993 to Toni Morrison. So that's why it's quite a long time.
So tell me, Jesse, what is special about Bob Dylan?
Well, Bob Dylan combines the folk of Woody Guthrie with the blues of Robert Johnson and the rock of Elvis in the late 50s into his own special blend. But what's really distinctive about it is that in transmitting these traditional forms, he gives it a really strong sense of morality and moral authority. He speaks to the bad parts of American society and politics and the bad parts of the world, particularly in the mid-60s. And I think that's never been more significant than today, 2016.
There's no question about the broad appeal of ethics and morality. However, we are talking about literature.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Is it true that the Nobel Prize Committee in Sweden starts to adopt a broad set of standards in choosing their strongest candidates in each individual field of the prize?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question.
I'm alluding to the issue of politicization.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, because when the Swedish Academy awarded the prize, let me see, the most precious prize to a songwriter, so it's immensely controversial. I think just Jesse mentioned something which is also very interesting. He mentioned broadly that why Bob Dylan is so important, such an important figure. But for me, for a person from the field of literature, I can see is the Swedish Academy adopts the policy of return to basics. So what are the basic core qualities of literature? That is the key issue. So that is to say that the Swedish Academy revived the tradition of the basic criterion of judging literature, that is the musicality of words and orality, the oral tradition. These are the two essential aspects of literature which has forgotten for hundreds of years.
Alois, what are the most basic fundamentals of literature?
I think storytelling, and most of Bob Dylan's songs, or the most iconic ones, are storytelling. You know, they have almost a beginning, middle and end, as well as the moral aspect. But things like, for example, Hurricane, one of the longest and the most famous ones, it has an element of storytelling, which is obviously a fundamental aspect of literature in most forms.
Is what she says broad enough to include the basic elements of literature?
Yes, I would say it is, but I would add to story, song. Story and song are the two basic facets of literature. And if we go back to the Western Enlightenment, which we see starting with philosophy like Francis Bacon and Descartes, I think what really lays the groundwork for this empirical philosophy that leads to all of the civilization that we see around us today is the French troubadours, who take us away from the ideological stronghold of the Catholic doctrines and dogmas to say, look into my eyes, and you will know when you see my love that it's real. That allows us to focus on empirical experience instead of just dogma. So the songs, even just the love songs about looking into the eyes, and that's something that Dylan says in almost every one of his songs. That puts him in a tradition going all the way back in both China and the West to ancient times.
Bush Sr. would not only just say, look me in the eye, he would also say, read my lips. So what do you think of the oral presentation of Bob Dylan?
I think that it's, if we trace literature into thousands of years ago, I think that we can also say that literature originates in oral tradition. So you can see at the very beginning, we don't have a lot of story. We don't have a lot of storylines. The story and storylines, and also especially come to a very later stage in the period of the rise of novel in the 18th century. So the writers, especially the novelists, they pay great attention to the plot. The plot is a higher form of development of story. But at the very beginning, people stress or pay great attention to, namely orality, namely oral tradition. For example, if you go to Africa, so you can see there, they have oral literature called orature.
Are you sort of going back to the tribal culture? Because you seem to be suggesting that you want to rejuvenate oral discourse about history, literature, and whatever that can be written down in ancient times. If you are not talking about the prehistoric Stone Age. Alois, do you find any ring of truth in what I say, in my response to his analysis?
I think going back further obviously does, it goes to more tribal, but I don't think it's necessarily the only thing that sort of going back to orality takes us to. It's also sort of a more raw focus on just emotion, I think, in literature. So I partly agree, but I also think it's not the only thing that comes from it.
But what was it that attracted the Nobel Prize Committee in Sweden in terms of oral expression? Because it's you who said such words like, a songwriter who tells story in the vocal expression, I mean in the sound, it's a different format of presentation, isn't it?
It's a deeply musical form. We can't forget the music as well, and that does take us straight back to Africa. People talk about Dust in the Wind, songs like that. They'll say that it's the drumming that really captures them. But in terms of the literary value of the lyrics, Dylan's chief achievement was to find a way to use American forms to give Americans an ability to criticize the Vietnam War, economic inequality, civil rights issues, especially for black people in the South and around the country in the United States. And those issues, inequality, nuclear disarmament, international relations, have become even more significant in the recent times. So it's almost as if the Nobel Prize Committee wants to say, hey, the folk singing protest songs of the 60s have new relevance in today's world.
Yeah, I would like to add very briefly to Jesse's talk. So here, I think that the first important issue that I've mentioned that is about orality in Bob Dylan's songs, and also I trace back to the tradition because I think that Bob Dylan influenced heavily by blues, right? And also the second thing I want to mention, just to pick up.
I was about to go back to New Orleans, where blues, turned the city into a capital city of jazz. But it was destroyed almost overnight by Hurricane Katrina.
That's a pity. Okay, so I wanted to pick up the topic you have mentioned about lyrics, right? Because also a lot of people mentioned about the lyrics or lyrical quality in Bob Dylan's songs, and some people are amazed to say that why you pick up Bob Dylan as a Nobel laureate. Is it because of his lyrical quality, simply because of that? What I'm saying that actually if you examine all the Nobel Prize laureates, you will find there are two. Actually, there's a balance between lyrical force and epic power. So you can say if you find that all this, if you among like during year of 100 years of Nobel Prize for Literature history, so you can see clearly there's a kind of there are a lot of people, a lot of writers, they are awarded for the reason of their lyrical force, while more writers, they get Nobel Prize because of the epic vision. So you can see, so there's an epic and lyric, so there's balance here.
Yes.
Then what do you think of the defiance of Bob Dylan, who refused to attend the award ceremony in Lloyd?
I think it doesn't necessarily say that much about how he feels about the prize, because he's been known for stepping out of the public sphere before, after a motorcycle accident, and I think after a lengthy career, I think not wanting to enter into the politics, which you mentioned earlier.
There was obviously a strong character in what he wrote for lyrics, but what do you think of the character himself, Bob Dylan? What's the defiance headline-making story for your countrymen?
Well, Bob Dylan has been around so long. There's always been a controversy over the fact that he started off in folk and he made such a big splash in 1964 and 65 with the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, a student protest movement. But then after 1965, he went more rock, and so he got his first attacks from people that said, "Why aren't you interested in social justice? Why do you want to do just regular rock and roll?" And he's always tried to say, "I'm an artist, I have a social conscience, but I'm also a human being, and I'm an entertainer interested in perfecting my craft, so I have to have the freedom to do what I want." As his life has gone on, he's a Minnesotan who is the grandchildren of Russian Jewish immigrants, but in the late 70s he briefly converted to Christianity, and today he says he does not have any organized religion. He constantly is shifting. He's a very chameleon figure, and I think when someone that famous does that, doesn't keep a stable brand name, then people begin to criticize you.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue. In this broad brainstorming session of dialogue, we are very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhao Baisheng, Director of the World Autobiography Center at Peking University, Alois McAllister, a student at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Jesse Field, whose PhD in Asian literature is from the University of Minnesota, which Bob Dylan also attended, because we are discussing the broad implications of this latest literature prize for Nobel Prize. I mean, Bob Dylan became the laureate. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Professor Zhao, can you brief us on the history of those who refused to attend the award ceremony? Why were there any stories behind their refusal to go there and get the prize?
This actually, it's a very interesting story and also a little bit complicated story. Some of the Nobel laureates, they refused to attend the Nobel laureate ceremony for different reasons, and I think some of them for political reasons, some of them for health reasons. For example, recently, that is like Doris Lessing. I think she did not attend the Nobel Prize ceremony for health reasons, and also like Jelinek, and also more recent example like Harold Pinter. Right? All these people, they did not actually in the new century. They did not attend the ceremony. So that is to say that the members of Future Academy, they are not surprised that. But there's also a very interesting history. I think that the most controversial thing about Nobel Prize is one very famous writer called Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher. And he definitely refused to attend the ceremony. He said he refused to accept any official honor. But actually, that is not, actually Swedish Academy is not official honor. So you can see clearly there's a lot of things behind the scene, because every writer has his own philosophical ideology.
So Sartre represented the strong spirit of a satire for prize of literature. But do you two guys understand why the Chinese authorities have been very sensitive to the Nobel Prize for Peace? Because for most of the Chinese observers here, they are not very happy about politicizing a Nobel Prize, which is supposed to be more independent from intervention of politics and other noises. Alloys.
I think it's impossible to separate literature or arts in general from politics, because it's produced in the context of that political setting. So I think even though in an ideal world sort of measuring literature and giving prizes would be independent from context, it never will be.
Literature is, of course, not divorced from reality, political, economic, social alike. What do you think of what she says about the close interconnectivity between literature, peace-winning efforts of whoever, and the political realities of different political institutions?
I think certain years it'll be politicized, and certain years it'll be less political. I mean, we can think of 2012, Moyen got the prize, and that was undoubtedly the vast majority of the press and critics agreed there was a politicization effort going on there, or at least the critics politicized the award, whether or not we don't actually know exactly how the committee works. I know that in that case, Professor Goran Malmquist, who sits on the committee and is the great China expert there, had been pushing for Moyen for quite a long time. The following year, when they gave it to Alice Munro, she has absolutely no political, well, I wouldn't say absolutely no, but little political element to her literature. She's a Canadian who's already well established. I think something else that we have to take into account is that in the 2 years that followed that, Patrick Modiano 2014 and Svetlana Alexiov in 2015, these are writers with deep social consciences that don't have a world audience, and the prize served to elevate them to a world audience level. But in the case of Bob Dylan, he already has more audience than he could ever want. It's almost as if the prize committee wants to get some of the allure of Bob Dylan. They make themselves a little bit more popular.
Let's take a look at other laureates of the Nobel Literature Prize. Winston Churchill, the wartime leader of Great Britain during the Second World War, received the prize in recognition of both his speeches during the Second World War and the British histories he wrote after the war. Those are unusual, at least in not being fictional literature, and there was controversy surrounding the award. Is there a history of unusual or unexpected recipients, Professor Zhao?
Yeah, I think it's, normally people think it's unusual, and also people also think that Bob Dylan this year is unusual. But for me, it's not unusual at all. Because if you look at the the history of Nobel Prize, you can see clearly that there are historians who got Nobel Prize. There are philosophers like Bertrand Russell, and a lot of people regard Winston Churchill as a historian. He is a historian, but he's also a biographer, autobiographer. So actually, the citation mentions particularly that Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize because of his historical and biographical writing, as well as his oratorical writing. I mean, so there are three key genres. That is, today people went. So actually, this has problem with the canonization of literature. So today, if you read books like this, The Cycle of American Literature, so if you read this, so you will find that all these books, so there are major writers and major genres. So, and also, they practically exclude a lot of things which are really belong to the pantheon of literature, like oratory, like non-fictions. There's a lot of non-fictions. And also, so today, so we have, so the method which I denounce is called three major approaches: major writers, right, and major genres. When I say major genres, so almost all the literary history, they focused to some extent on the major genre: poetry, novel, and drama, by excluding the huge amount of this genres, which is called non-fiction. So that's why I think Nobel Prize did the right thing.
Eloise, do you count Winston Churchill as one of the major writers in contemporary British literature? And what was special about his writings? To my knowledge, I started reading his essays and writings from the early academic years in the early 1980s. I was impressed by his pompous and philosophical linguistic style.
I think he can't be exempt from being a major figure because he was influential in a number of other ways, which most major figures in literature are influential outside of their literature as well. I don't think pigeonholing people into just being a historian or a songwriter or a sort of literary figure is helpful, because people can be both.
But he's not canonized by the literary establishment like these historians of British literature. So if you read like the books like Anthology of British Literature, right?
Let me follow up your question. Eloise, the Nobel Prize for Literature was granted to Winston Churchill in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Was it largely because people were still immersed in the sweeping jubilation of the huge success in defeating Nazi Germany? Also because of his wartime speeches, which themselves were wonderful in arousing the strong sense of nationalism and in their battles against the enemy in the European battlefields.
I think that probably is the case, as it's not then and now people still use those speeches as examples of patriotism and nationalism and just good delivery of a speech. It's the sort of thing that you study in primary school as early as that in the UK. So I think that probably was a factor, or if not, it would be viewed as that today by most young people, speaking as one. I can't say.
In your estimation, Jesse, why did Winston Churchill win the Nobel Prize for Literature?
Well, it absolutely has a political and historical element. Prime Minister Churchill's rhetoric was absolutely invaluable to winning the war. His voice on the radio, along with FDR's, stirred the English-speaking world to action. And we owe so many pieces of our rhetoric, words like the Iron Curtain, for example. Those are
the
Churchill
speech.
Yes, his speeches, his essays, and his histories, particularly his history of the English-speaking peoples and his histories of the wars, and his stances. They follow a fine line between the old-style colonialism of Britain and looking forward to a post-war Britain that would be, unfortunately, enmeshed in the Cold War.
I think one of his major contributions is he did a great contribution to a very important genre, that is autobiography and biography. So one of the Yale professors said that all the history of the Second World War written by Winston Churchill is a disguised autobiography. So he is a central figure in that several volumes of of the Second World War history. And also the second thing that people always fail to mention about Winston Churchill is that actually Winston Churchill is an excellent biographer.
Can you remember any punchlines by William Churchill? Sorry, by not William Shakespeare, by Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
If you're going through hell, keep going. I think that's the kind of thing school teachers used to say with regard to homework. It's the sort of thing. It's rhetoric in sort of the UK youth. I think it's the, even though you don't necessarily know where it came from, you would still remember it as a child, and then as you grow older you understand the context.
But do people still read a lot of Winston Churchill, I mean younger generation today in UK?
Is he still a big name for the younger generation in the UK?
A big name, definitely, but I don't know about whether...
The UK is of course remembered for some of the big names. William Shakespeare and Winston Churchill are one of them, except for Lady Thatcher. But let's come back to examine Bob Dylan's influence on China. I don't think Mo Yan, who is also by far perhaps the only Chinese laureate of the Nobel Prize for Literature, for what?
That's of course not completely true.
I know you're going to question your response to Mo Yan.
We have did a names.
We've done a couple of shows about this.
Several years ago. So I think that Mu Yan also, it's when Mu Yan won the Nobel Prize, right? Of course, you know the Chinese response, right? So if I think that when you say Mu Yan, we compare Mu Yan and Bob Dylan, so they're from totally different tradition, right? So when we say Mu Yan, Mu Yan's tradition, so you can see Mu Yan's, I think, achievement is mainly owing to his expert combination of Chinese narrative art and Western influences. I think that he combined these two huge forces.
Thank you very much. We don't have enough time, obviously, for Mo Yan, the Chinese laureate of Nobel Literature Prize. But I promise to come back with Professor Zhao and Jesse Eloise for another edition, brainstorming about Nobel Prize. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.